I remember the exact second I stopped flinching every time someone said her name. It wasn't when I found the messages on his phone, still warm from his pocket. It wasn't when he sat across from me at our own kitchen table and called 31 years a chapter. It wasn't even when my own niece, the girl I'd driven to soccer practice 3 times a week for a decade, because her own mother couldn't be bothered, walked into a mediation room, wearing my late mother's brooch, and sat down beside the man who used to be my husband, like she'd been assigned a seat there. It was the moment right after that, when my lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Pauline Ashworth, who I had never once heard raise her voice in 4 years, let out a laugh so abrupt it bounced off the windows of that downtown Calgary office tower, like a dropped glass. I watched my niece's face. I watched the smile she'd been wearing since she walked in. The smile that said she already knew how this story ended, slipped just slightly at the corner. My name is Corinne Whitlock. And this is the story of the morning. 2 people walked into a room certain they had already won, and discovered the game had never belonged to them in the first place. Let me tell you what my life looked like from the outside. Because from the outside it looked like something out of a magazine spread on Mount Royal, the old part of Calgary where the houses have stone foundations and the trees are older than the province's highways. I had spent 4 years restoring that house myself, room by room, not because we couldn't have hired a crew, but because I needed to understand the bones of the place. That has always been how I work. From the studs out, my husband, Graham Pemberton, came from a name that meant something in Alberta, long before either of us were born. His grandfather had started Pemberton Steel in the 50s, with one welding shed outside Lethbridge. By the time Graham's father, an old rancher of a man named Walter Pemberton, had finished building it, Pemberton Steel was a national fabrication and infrastructure supplier. With contracts running through 6 provinces, a name on bridges and pipelines, and half the new builds going up in Calgary's Beltline. Walter was 76 the year everything happened. Sharp as a tack still, but tired, and everyone, the board, the trade papers, the extended family at Thanksgiving, assumed Graham was the natural successor. He had the title, President and CEO, embossed right there on the business cards. He had his photograph in the Calgary Herald business section twice that year alone. And behind him, the way women doing the real work so often are, invisible, was me. I came into the marriage with a background in industrial finance and risk auditing. Before Graham, I'd spent 6 years consulting for mid-sized manufacturing operations across Alberta and Saskatchewan. The kind of work where you go looking for the places a company is quietly bleeding money through bad contracts and sloppy oversight. I had a gift for it. I could read a balance sheet the way some people read a room. When Graham and I married, I stepped back from outside consulting. Not because he asked, but because Pemberton Steel needed exactly what I could see. And because I loved the work more than I ever loved being thanked for it. What I did over the following years wasn't glamorous. It was late nights with spreadsheets spread across the dining table, while the kids did homework upstairs. It was flights to Fort McMurray and Regina, because Graham hated travel and I didn't mind it. It was a full restructuring of the company's Western logistics network that took 16 months and saved Pemberton Steel close to $11 million. It was a renegotiated supplier contract with their primary steel mill that nobody had touched in 13 years and was quietly costing the company 7% a quarter. I never asked for my name on anything. I had Graham. I had the work. I told myself that was enough. My niece Brooklyn came into my life the way nieces do, gradually and then all at once. My younger sister had her young and struggled, and somewhere around Brooklyn's 11th birthday, I simply became the aunt who showed up. Piano recitals, parent-teacher interviews her own mother forgot, her first car, a used Civic I co-signed for when she was 22, because the bank wouldn't touch her credit alone. We were never equals, not really, but I trusted her the way you trust someone you raised half of. I should have asked harder questions about the way she watched my house, my husband, my life, like she was taking inventory. I found out on a Tuesday in late September. The leaves along the river pathway had just started turning that particular Alberta gold. And I had come home a day early from a conference in Banff. Because the sessions wrapped ahead of schedule and I thought I'd surprise Graham maybe pick up Thai food from the place on 17th he liked. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found. When I came through that front door, the one with the stained glass transom, I'd restored myself. There was no ambiguity to reach for. No alternate explanation I could talk myself into. And what moved through me standing in that doorway wasn't the dramatic, movie version of devastation. It was quieter than that, colder. Graham looked up and saw me, and the very first thing that crossed his face, before guilt, before calculation, was irritation. As though I'd interrupted something that had nothing to do with me. Brooklyn stood up slowly. She didn't rush. She smoothed her shirt with both hands and looked at me with an expression I had never once seen on her in 15 years. Flat, unbothered, almost bored. "You knew this was coming, Aunt Corinne," she said, in a voice as even as a kitchen counter. "Some people build the house. Other people are just meant to live in it. That's not cruelty, that's just how it goes." I drove to my sister-in-law's place that night, sat in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could make a call. Then I called Pauline Ashworth, my personal lawyer, not Graham's family's lawyer, not the company's. A woman I'd hired 4 years earlier on the quiet advice of a mentor, who told me that any woman doing real financial work inside a family company needed her own counsel, separate and untouchable. That advice, given over coffee at a Tim Hortons on a forgettable Thursday, turned out to be the most important professional decision I ever made. What followed was 8 weeks of very careful, very quiet work. While Graham and Brooklyn moved openly through Calgary together, showing up at a Pemberton Steel anniversary gala, being seen at the Stampede grounds in matching Western wear, like a couple announcing themselves, Pauline and I were building something in the background. Not out of bitterness, not even out of anger by that point, out of precision. The mediation room was on the 22nd floor of a building downtown with a clear view south, toward the Stampede grounds and the river. That morning the sky was that flat prairie gray. Calgary gets in late autumn, and the light coming through the windows made everything look slightly washed out. Brooklyn arrived before I did. I heard later she'd come almost an hour early. She wore a fitted charcoal blazer, my mother's old sapphire brooch pinned at the collar. Dark trousers pressed to a knife edge. She'd had her hair done, sleeker than usual, more deliberate. She looked dressed for a press conference, not a divorce settlement. She sat down beside Graham at the far end of the table, which she had no legal standing to do. She wasn't a party to the proceedings. She had no counsel present representing her. She was there because this was a performance, and she'd dressed for the part. Graham's lawyer was a man named Desmond Fairweather, a high-asset divorce specialist with an excellent reputation, retained, I'd learn later, at a rate that reflected real confidence in the outcome. He'd reviewed what Graham's side had disclosed about the marital estate, and built a settlement offer that was technically clean, fast, and designed to be accepted by a woman who didn't fully grasp what she was actually entitled to. Pauline and I sat across from them. She placed a navy folder flat on the table and did not open it. Preliminary documents were exchanged. Desmond made his opening statement, something measured about equitable distribution under Alberta's matrimonial property rules, careful to acknowledge Graham's central role in the company's continued growth. Pauline let him finish every sentence without interrupting once. Then Brooklyn reached into her handbag. I don't know what she was thinking. Maybe the silence felt too neutral for her. Maybe she'd rehearsed this. The clean final punctuation that would close the story on her own terms. She drew out a single bill, crisp, freshly withdrawn, and held it between 2 fingers before sliding it across the table, until it stopped in front of my legal pad. She looked at me with a smile that had nothing warm left in it. Take the 50, she said. Call yourself an Uber back to wherever you're staying. We're done here. The room went completely still. Desmond actually flinched, a visible twitch at the corner of his eye. The kind a professional tries to swallow and doesn't quite manage. Graham's jaw tightened, not with shame, but with the particular irritation of a man who hadn't approved this script and didn't like surprises. And then Pauline Ashworth laughed. Not a polite sound. A real laugh, sharp and startled and entirely genuine, that rang off the glass and filled that room with something nobody in it had planned for. Graham sat upright so fast his chair scraped the floor. What exactly is funny to you right now? Pauline took off her glasses, took a slow breath, set them back on. Then she picked up the navy folder, placed it dead center on the table, and turned it so the embossed letterhead faced Graham's side of the room. I apologize, she said, her voice dropping to something quiet and very clear. I wasn't prepared for that gesture to be entered into the record. It changes the posture of this entire conversation considerably, in my client's favor. Brooklyn's voice sharpened. Explain yourself. Pauline looked at her for a long, unhurried moment. I'm laughing, she said softly, because you and Mr. Pemberton both appear to be operating under the sincere belief that Graham holds controlling authority over Pemberton Steel. She tapped the folder once with one finger. He does not. The silence that followed those last three words was a different kind of silence entirely. Before, it had been the pressurized, held breath quiet of people waiting for someone to accept defeat. This was hollow. Like the floor had been quietly removed from under one side of the room, and everyone was waiting to find out if it would hold. Desmond leaned forward immediately. That's a significant claim. I'd want to see whatever documentation. You're holding it, Pauline said. Here's what's inside that folder. Walter Pemberton, Graham's father, the man who'd built a welding shed outside Lethbridge into a national steel supplier over 5 decades, had never formally handed controlling authority to his son. Not legally. Not in any binding structural sense. Graham had the title. He had his picture in the paper and his name on the company truck doors. What he didn't have was the votes. Roughly 4 years earlier, Walter had quietly restructured the company's ownership into a family holding trust. The trust held 58% of all voting shares, the controlling interest. Every major financial decision, every acquisition, every significant structural change, required trustee sign-off. And the trustee, the one with full authority over that controlling stake, was not Graham. It was me. Walter had made that call during the year I'd spent rebuilding the company's Western logistics network. He'd watched me work for months. He'd seen how I read a contract, how I found exactly where a system was bleeding, how I fixed things in ways that actually held. He was a builder himself, in the oldest sense of the word, and he recognized what he was looking at. Without telling Graham, without telling a soul, he decided the person who genuinely understood the company deserved the legal protection to match. Walter Pemberton executed the trust restructuring in the fall 4 years ago, Pauline said, sliding pages across the table one at a time, slow and deliberate. Corinne Whitlock was named sole trustee of the Pemberton Family Holding Trust. That trust controls 58% of all voting shares. Mr. Pemberton retains his title and a minority equity position. He cannot authorize a merger, approve an acquisition, or restructure debt above $250,000 without trustee sign-off. She paused. Without my client's sign-off. Desmond was reading fast now, scanning pages with the focused, rapid energy of a lawyer realizing the entire foundation of his case needed rebuilding from the ground up. It wasn't panic on his face exactly. It was the controlled, professional cousin of panic, which is somehow worse to watch. Graham had gone completely still. Not the restless stillness of a man waiting for his turn. The rigid, breathless stillness of someone trying to process information that rearranges everything he thought he knew about his own life. Brooklyn looked at Graham, then at the documents, then back at Graham. For the first time in 15 years of knowing her, through every birthday and recital and quiet Sunday dinner that had built the trust she'd just spent, she had nothing to say. No line, no exit, nothing. There's one more matter, Pauline said. 5 years ago, before I began substantive work for the company, I advised Corinne to formalize her contributions through an independent consulting agreement, not as a wife doing a favor, not as family pitching in, as a contracted professional, with a documented scope of work and compensation terms. At the time I'd signed it almost as a formality, a piece of paper Pauline insisted was smart to have, tucked away in a drawer I barely thought about again. That piece of paper, and 5 years of documented work attached to it, was now the second document in the folder. My client entered into a formal consulting agreement with Pemberton Steel prior to commencing the work described, Pauline said. The documented contributions include a logistics restructuring that reduced operating costs by an estimated $11 million over 5 years, and a supplier renegotiation that corrected a 7% quarterly margin loss that had gone unaddressed for over a decade. She looked at Desmond directly. Compensation owed under that agreement is a contractual obligation of the company, separate from and independent of any marital property calculation. Which means your client's settlement offer doesn't begin to reflect my client's actual legal and financial position. Desmond asked for a recess. Pauline gave him 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Brooklyn didn't speak to Graham once. She sat with her hands folded on the table, staring at some fixed point past the window, at the flat gray Calgary sky. The $50 bill was still sitting on the table in front of my notepad. Nobody touched it. I won't walk you through every line of the final settlement. Some of it stays private by mutual agreement, and I'm at peace with that. What I'll tell you is what mattered. Graham kept his title at Pemberton Steel and his minority stake. He kept the condo he'd already moved into. The truck, the base boat he'd bought without asking me. All the visible, surface-level markers of a life built around an image of himself. What he lost was the substance underneath that image. The authority everyone, including Brooklyn, had assumed he held. The story he'd been telling about who he was and what he controlled. That story was finished. The consulting agreement was honored in full. The trust structure was formalized as part of the settlement record. I walked out of that building with a financial outcome that actually reflected years of real, documented, consequential work. Not the outcome of a woman dismissed with a $50 bill and a rideshare app. Brooklyn left before the final signatures were even exchanged. I didn't watch her go. I heard the door. I heard later, through a cousin who still talks to everyone, that she and Graham didn't last past the winter. No announcement, no public blow-up. It just stopped the way things built on a false foundation eventually do. Quietly. Without ceremony. Walter called me 2 weeks after the settlement closed. He didn't say much. Asked how I was holding up. Said he was glad Pauline had been thorough. There was a long pause on the line. The kind where you can hear someone choosing their words. And then he said, in his slow rancher's way, "You always saw that company clearer than anyone who ever carried the family name. Corinne. I just made sure the paperwork finally caught up to what was true." I stayed on as trustee for another 16 months. Walter and I worked well together, always had. At a natural point, I stepped back by my own choice, left the trust in clean, well-documented order, and walked out of the Pemberton Steel offices, for the last time on a Friday afternoon in early spring, when the magpies were loud along the Bow River pathway, and the snow was finally letting go of the riverbank. I live in a smaller place on the southwest side now, a good kitchen, a desk by a window where the morning light lands right where I sit. I consult independently these days. Mostly for mid-sized Alberta companies that need someone who can read between the lines of a balance sheet, who can find the assumption nobody's questioned in a decade, who can seize what's actually happening underneath the story a company tells about itself. I'm good at it. I've always been good at seeing what's actually there. Here's what I want to leave you with. Brooklyn slid that $50 bill across the table because she had already decided what I was. Finished. Replaceable. A chapter closing quietly. She'd written the ending before she walked through that door, and she wanted me to sign off on it. What she never once considered, what people like her almost never consider, is the work that happens before anyone's watching. The years of quiet, documented, unglamorous work that nobody photographed or toasted or put in the company newsletter. The agreements filed away in a drawer. The restructuring that saved millions and never had a single name attached to it. She saw the surface of a life and thought that was the whole of it. She was wrong. And the moment Pauline Ashworth laughed, that sharp, genuine, involuntary laugh that rang off the glass of a boardroom on the 22nd floor, with the Stampede grounds laid out below us, that was the moment the room finally found out what had been true the whole time. The people who underestimate you aren't always wrong about everything. They're often right that you're quiet. Right that you don't take up much space. Right that you never made a show of what you were carrying. They're just wrong about what that quiet actually means. So I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Has someone in your own life ever underestimated you so completely that when the truth finally came out, even you were surprised by what you'd quietly built? Tell me your story below. I read every single one, and if this one stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe to Nova Payback. New story every single day.